I come from a good family. You know, we had our problems and our struggles, but at the same time, it was a solid ground in which my vocation could take root. My family grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is, you know, it's up in the northeast of Pennsylvania, and it's a nice area, but it's, you know, there's not a lot of, economically it's kind of gone down in the past several years, but it was a wonderful place to grow up in a very ethnic area, so there's the faith is still alive up there. I grew up in a small town up there, so there wasn't too many Catholics in the town I grew up in. It was a very old town, actually. It was a part of the Underground Railroad at one time. And when I grew up there, it was my family, you know, we went to the local Catholic church, and they said we were kind of minorities in the town, and there weren't too many Catholics. But my great aunt worked in the rectory, and she just would help out the priest there, and which was kind of the traditional way of doing things. They would have somebody who never got married and an older woman help out the priest in the rectory. And so I would often get chances, you know, when I was serving Mass afterwards. And we used to have to serve during the week. We had a more traditional priest, and he wanted us even there at 7 o'clock in the morning on school days. So I would go there, we'd serve Mass, and then I would have breakfast with the priest, and then I would get on the bus and go from there to school. So I guess that was the beginning of the seeds of vocation there, just being able to be close to the priest and to get to know him as a person, talk about the Yankees and some of our favorite sports and different things. And so I kind of just started thinking about the priesthood. But one thing about my mother was that she was really open to kind of just say to us, well, you know, some of you maybe, I have two sisters, two older sisters, and she would say to us, well, you might be called to a vocation. You might be called, of course you're called to a vocation maybe to marriage, but you might also be called to the religious life, and we just want you to be open to that. And that was just in the 80s when things were kind of, you know, they were starting to really feel the pinch of not having a lot of vocations, and I think people were beginning to talk about the call more and trying to promote families to think about it and think about, you know, and young people as well. And so my mother was very open to that, but she never pressured us, and she was always open to whatever we chose to do in our life. And of course, my sisters would choose married life, and I, through the process of several years, would choose the priesthood and the religious life. So, but it started out, I guess, in fourth grade. I started thinking about it, and maybe that's a time of when a young person starts to really think about like what they want to do when they grow up. And I went to a public school because it was a small town. There were no Catholic schools, and I started to think, well, maybe the priesthood. I wanted to be like this priest that I saw during the week when I would serve at Mass. And I knew something wonderful was going on at Mass with the Eucharist, and I didn't quite understand it, but I knew that God was there. And I went to school, and one day, and I guess we were talking about what we wanted to be when we grew up, and I said I wanted to be a priest. So it was a public school, and I don't know, my friends just laughed at me. So it wasn't, they just were like, why would you want to do that? You know, you can't get married and all this. And most of them weren't practicing. They weren't Catholics. Many of them were Protestant, or there were a few who were Catholics. But so I kind of just didn't mention it then after that for many years, at least in front of my friends. But I think the seed is it's always there. You know, it's always that seed of faith, and that vocation is always there. I've heard someone describe it as a tap on your shoulder. I mean, you can kind of like, if someone's constantly tapping on your shoulder, you notice it. But after a while, maybe if you're paying attention to something else, you wouldn't notice it, but it's still there. And then once you kind of quiet yourself, you would notice once again that there's that tap on your shoulder. And I guess that was the way it was with me. I went through high school and just didn't really know what I wanted to be. And I'm a quiet person. I come from a quiet family, and I was voted most shy in my class. The idea of being somebody, you know, who out there leading a congregation was very, like, it was foreign to me in a way. It was something that I thought I couldn't do, but, you know, yet it was something that I felt drawn to. So there was those two things going on, feeling drawn to it and then recognizing our own human weaknesses. And I think we always do that. I mean, there's always weaknesses that we have, whether it be, you know, character flaws or whatever, or, just things that in our personality, or just struggles with sin, and we think that we're not worthy or can't do it. So that was some of the struggle that I had. But then as I got to the end of my high school years and was kind of really thinking about, well, what do I want to do? I had somebody, I was serving Mass as I dutifully did, and I wasn't the best server, but I was always there, and somebody from our parish who was a well-respected man, and he said after Mass that when I was serving in the 11th grade, I believe, he said, well, God told me that you were called to be a priest when I saw you there on the altar, and that was, that really got me thinking. I was just, wow, if God spoke to this man, and I mean, he was a well-respected man in our parish and someone we'd known for many years. So at that point, I really started to kind of think about it. I think I grabbed some brochures or something from the parish on the diocesan priesthood, because that's all I knew. I didn't know any religious communities in my area. Just started thinking and praying about it, but yet I still didn't feel like I was ready or I could do it, and so I went with the whole idea of I was going to be a teacher just like my mother was, and so I went into education and eventually special education, and I got my degree, and I went to a small Catholic college up in Scranton, Pennsylvania called Marywood University, and it was a good college, especially for education, and small, and there was a lot of churches around that area, and I could I got more and more involved with my faith, and I would spend time before the Blessed Sacrament there in the chapel. And some people thought kind of a little weird, because there wasn't a lot of young people there at the chapel, and but I just was persevering in this idea that I had a vocation and that I had to follow it. So I went to some discernment retreats. I went with the diocese, and then later on I went with the Passionists and a couple other communities that were local, because I didn't know any others. But I had this feeling that I was called to an order or a community that was dedicated to the Blessed Virgin, something with my history and my family, and I think that why I was able to persevere in my vocation and really recognize it was that the love for the Blessed Mother. We would recite the Rosary, not every night, but almost every night as a family. My grandmother, when she was living with us, would get us all together, and we would just recite the family rosary. My grandmother herself would pray 3 or 4 rosaries a day, one for each one of her grandchildren, and for them and for their life. And I really think that was instrumental. And we had a nice big statue of the Blessed Mother, Our Lady of Grace, in our house. And I can just remember just walking by it and saying a little prayer as a kid, and I just felt that maternal, the love of the Blessed Mother, and that was something that drew me to her, and I wanted to find a congregation or a community that had a great devotion to her. And so after, in college, after I'd visited several communities, I finally just decided, well, I got to pick 2, and I got to look through this guide for religious ministries. This is in the 90s, so the internet was just kind of in its infancy, sort of, so there wasn't the variety of websites and so forth that you can go through now. Young people can. But so I was looking through this guide for religious ministries, and he had postcards there, and I sent out 2 postcards. I thought, well, the Mercedarians, I had never heard of them, but I thought, wow, this is a really interesting charism, 800 years old, and they're named after the Blessed Mother, and they're faithful to the church, and all these things that it said on their advertisement. And then this other community, which I won't mention, but it was a community that was dedicated to the Blessed Mother as well. And I got information from both of those communities, and after looking at those communities and their charism and how it was lived out, and I felt really drawn to the Mercedarians, because it had that special, focus on mercy, which our community was founded to ransom Christians who were enslaved to the Muslims in Spain 800 years ago. And so there's that whole idea of God's mercy and us practicing the corporal and the spiritual works of mercy in our own life. So there was something that kind of interested me in that, and it was only as I started to make application to the community, I had visited Philadelphia here, and felt a peace about it. I had a really good spiritual director who was a religious, and he said to me, don't look for fireworks. And I always say that to young people today too. it's best to visit, come and see. That's what Jesus said. But when you go there, don't necessarily look for fireworks, but look for a sense of peace and a sense of I can do this, and these are people that I, like-minded, and the type of work that they do and the way that they pray is something that I can do and I have a desire to do. So that's what I found in our community, and then made application. While in application, I found out that our community was, on my birthday was the day that it was first established canonically. So that was a very beautiful sign of God that I was on the right path. And so I continued on and went into the formation program. And that's my story. Is so much in the family. And the more that we reform the family, the more that we strengthen the family life, the more that solid vocations to the priesthood, religious life, and also to marriage will come forth from that.